Wojak slowly strode into the living room of the small home, the TV being the only light currently in the house, tinging everything it touched in its ghostly blue glow. Wojak stepped close to the reclining chair in the center of the room, taking a quick glance at the body that sat in it before looking over to see the commercials streaming across the screen. She was a blonde woman, thin, and seemed to be in about her 30s, but that was hard to tell with how the rifle she had used had turned her head into a sickening flower shape, with petals of meat and skull stretching forth in 3 directions. Almost all the guerrillas, or rebels, whatever their proper name was, that they had to deal with today, were women. Wojak found that strange. Most girls he knew weren't stupid enough to run at armored cars throwing grenades. But as he thought about it more, he could imagine someone ideologically driven enough could certainly do something that stupid, and he supposed that included women. He wondered if it was a cell that was guided by enemy intelligence, or just some group that bought into the idea that the DV really were Nazis. Both sides were calling each other Nazis relentlessly on social media and news of all kinds, though Wojak was fairly certain it wasn't true in either case. However, with the constant stream of news and lies that had been pumped out across every form of media over the past 2 years now, Wojak was surprised to see nothing of the kind playing on this TV screen. It was nothing but some cheap-looking German reality TV show, though the volume was far too low to hear what the women on screen were complaining about. The show looked old. Would have had to have been. Shows like this hadn't been made here for at least half a decade. It was interesting, though, Wojak thought, that she had turned the volume down before blowing her brains out. He would have wanted the volume as loud as possible to distract him from the fact that his brains were about to be splattered onto the ceiling. He glanced up, not seeing as much gore as he expected on the white ceiling, just a smattering of red blood. He reached up to pull his balaclava down to take a smoke, only to realize he had already pulled his mask down, and that a cigarette already sat perched in his mouth, burning down moment by moment. He wondered if that was why he didn't really find the room to smell that awful, or perhaps he was now just used to the smell of death. There had been a lot of death that day. Kid had run out of nowhere and slipped a grenade into the window of an armored car, killing 3 of the 5 men inside. He had been the first to see her, and immediately jumped out of the car that had been just behind the one the girl had attacked, and rounded the corner of the narrow alley she had slipped away into. She was about 20 feet away when he turned the corner. Her back was to him as she ran. He didn't even hesitate, 3 rounds into the kid. God, she really was a kid, though. From the ID they had pulled from her house, she was approximately 15, named Alina Bauer. He had never realized how young that was. When he was 15, he thought he looked like an adult, and thought everyone in his school did too. But looking at the girl, he figured it must have been his childlike perception of the world. As Alina hit the ground, he looked up to see a woman to her left, older than the girl, old enough to be her mother. She held a G-36 just like Wojak, but as Mrs. Bauer looked at him, her eyes went wide, and it seemed she lost whatever nerve she had used to pick up the rifle in the first place. She didn't move. She just stared at Wojak with her gun pointed toward the ground. Wojak blasted off 3 more rounds into her, too, and Mrs. Bauer went down clutching her torso as the rifle clattered to the ground. That's when everyone else started coming around down the alley, the entire platoon, it seemed. Wojak then operated on drilled-in training and slowly moved forward with 4 other men, keeping his eyes on the girls as screaming began emanating from one of the houses. Both the girls were dressed like completely harmless civilians. They even looked the part. Completely harmless milquetoast yuppies that had just blown up a truck. Wojak felt his palms start to sweat and his veins tighten as he approached both of them to find they were still alive. The kid was slowly moving, almost twitching, while the older woman stared unbelievingly at the ever-expanding stains of blood on her white blouse before she stared up at Wojak in childlike terror. She began to weep. Wojak kicked her in the face. His friends had been on that truck. They then heard the booming voice of their lieutenant and looked to see him motioning for them to bring the bodies inside the house he stood before, while a portly, middle-aged man sat on his knees next to him, clutching his nose. Wojak grabbed the kid by the ankle, dragging her toward the open door of the house, dropping her onto the white carpet of the living room as Alina began to cry. Some part of Wojak wanted to cry too, but that was by far overshadowed by the rage and adrenaline he felt coursing through his veins. The sound of the other soldiers shouting rocked the house as they surrounded the Bauer family in their living room, the order to fire sounding out through the clean halls, and Wojak was the first to respond. Full auto into the three rebels, like he was spraying them with a garden hose. 3 other men followed suit, followed by many more, as the ringing in their ears shut out the sound of gunfire and screaming. Technically, they were allowed to kill enemy combatants fighting without a uniform, and they had found 2 more rifles in the home of the mother, father, and daughter who had lived there. But not wanting to take any chances, they decided to burn the house down with the bodies inside before they started searching the rest of the town. It had taken them the whole day and had delayed the entire unit from reaching the front. The only other thing they had found was in this home, and the insurgent inside had done everyone a favor. Wojak could hear the other men stomping around upstairs, searching through everything, though he had a feeling this was the only thing they'd find. He wondered when the guilt would set in. This was by far the worst thing he had ever done, and he wasn't even sure how he'd become someone capable of executing people. He thought that maybe he had always been capable of it, and that this had just brought it out. The heart of man was desperately wicked after all. But the guilt hadn't set in yet. It usually didn't until a few days or even weeks later. His feet hurt, but he refused to sit, terrified that rest would bring about the realization of what he had done. Alina had been crying when he killed her, a little kid filled with bullet holes, in terrible pain, with her parents screaming around her as she died. She had also killed his friends, Chris, Nicholas, and Paul. But then again, the kid's death didn't bring any of them back. Wojak looked at the corpse sitting in the reclining chair, head floured, and brains on the ceiling, and almost envied it. He almost prayed to God, but thought that God must have turned away from him after this. So Wojak stood there in that dark living room and watched the TV.